This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner, and we are in Cheyenne, Wyoming for an interesting conversation that we have been trying to pull together for a better part of this year. Eric Toft from Private Landbrauerei Schönram is with me.
Correct.
Did I say that close enough?
That's close enough.
Okay. One of the more influential lager brewers in the world. Many brewers that I've talked to have implemented some of your techniques and approaches to lager brewing in their own brew houses. We can talk about some of those things. But we were supposed to have this conversation in Belgium back in February. And in fact, we had originally scheduled it. Joe Stang, our managing editor, who wrote a fantastic feature around you back in our 2020 lager issue.
Correct, yeah.
A beautiful story that goes into lots of depth around your approach to brewing. Joe had set it up for us to record this podcast episode at Cantillon after our podcast with Jean Vanois, and then you had personal circumstances that made that not possible. And then last weekend we were out at the Firestone Walker Invitational Beer Festival. And I didn't realize you were going to be there in person. I had actually reached out to Mark, your importer, who's in Southern California, thinking he was probably going to be repping the brewery. Turns out I show up on Friday afternoon, and there you are in the Firestone tap room having lunch with Matt. And and then after a few beers on Saturday night, I cajoled you into meeting me up here. And we're at Blacktooth Brewing in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Thank you to Thomas and Blacktooth here for allowing us to set up and have the podcast. We actually wrote a breakout brewer story about Blacktooth back in 2015. Go look it up on the Craft Beer and Brewing, the beerandbrewing.com website. It's all right there. Nonetheless, I'm excited that we are finally able to have this conversation about lager brewing. For those of us who were at the Firestone Walker Invitational, if you were at the Brewers Camp after the festival ended, you could see the Schönram bottles scattered around because all of the brewers were clamoring for whatever is left. And as I was talking to Vinny Gelurzo from Russian River earlier this week, he mentioned to me that he actually took a case of leftover beer for himself, and that was all he was drinking for the past week. I know you headed up there after the festival, but he told me yesterday that that's all he's been drinking for this past week.
That's a compliment. Nice to hear.
You certainly make beer for brewers. Beer that brewers respect, lager beer that is some of the best in the world. Obviously, Schönram was one of Craft Beer and Brewing's Beers of the Year last year. It was about time. We're going to dive into the Schönram approach to lager brewing. You, of course, are an American brewing in Germany, but have been there for multiple decades now. And anyway, can't wait to dive into some of the technical strictures, some of the creative approach. Well, I say creative, I would say ingredient and hyper focus. Some of the technical approaches to things like open top fermenting lager beer, and working within that kind of tradition to build character that is uniquely and distinctly Schönram. But first, for nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. G&D stands above the rest as the only chiller manufacturer that engineers your glycol piping for free. G&D also stands alone as the only chiller manufacturer with an in-house team of installers and engineers with 30 years of real-world field labor experience in breweries, wineries, and distilleries. Contact the Total Glycol System Design experts today at gdchillers.com. Also, support for this episode comes from BSG and the Malt House by RAR. The Malt House is your online source for cool and exclusive RAR malting company gear that you can't get anywhere else. T-shirts, hoodies, hats, socks, glassware, and even gear for your pets. Rep the malt you brew with and look sharp doing it. Take the tradition home at themalthouse.com. That's themalthaus.com. So, Eric, we normally start off the podcast with some background. Yours takes you across the ocean. Were you born here in Wyoming? Talk to me about this kind of history and your arc through brewing and life, and how you ended up as a head brewer or brewmaster for Schönram in Bavaria.
Yeah, I was nearly born here. My dad was drafted into Vietnam, and
your dad, who's sitting right here with us,
is sitting here with us. He was sent to an Air Force base in Ohio as a physician. So my mother was pregnant with me, and then that's where I was born. But grown up and spent my younger years here in Cheyenne. I went to the university to did my studies in geophysics and geology at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden. And when I was finishing my studies, there weren't many jobs available. I was enamored of the idea of working for the USGS and living in a tent and being in the mountains all the time, but they weren't hiring. The only jobs available were with major oil companies in Saudi Arabia, and it just didn't appeal to me that much. I'd been homebrewing all through my 4 years in Golden, and was a very early member of the AHA, and went to Boulder Homebrew Club meetings. Still have contact with a guy from there,
certain
Bill
guy
from Boulder, yeah. And I just decided, why not start a brewery? And homebrewers were starting breweries back then, and there weren't that many. There was the Boulder Brewing Company, and the Wing Coop opened up. There was Kessler in Montana. There was Red Hook in Seattle, and Thomas Kemper, Bainbridge Island, and then there were a couple in Portland, and then of course the iconic Sierra Nevada.
Sure.
On the way there, Pyramid Ales and Triple Rock Brew Pub and Buffalo Bill's Brew Pub, and that was about it. So I decided to do a little tour and visit what was existing in the West at that time, and made the decision to, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it properly and get a well-founded education in brewing before I take the plunge. So I didn't have any debt from my 4 years in Golden, and I didn't have any obligations.
Those were years where you could finish college without huge amounts of debt.
Exactly, yeah. So I was free, and I'd always wanted to spend some time in Europe. So I just went over there blindly, thinking if there was a chance or the possibility of getting an education in brewing, it would be in Germany. So I signed up for a 2-month intensive language course, and wrote letters to the professors at the brewing school in Weinstefan. Professor Nazis, I got a letter back after a couple of weeks, and he said that I had to work at least 1 year in a brewery with my previous education. Otherwise, I would have had to do a 3-year apprenticeship, but at least 1 year of practical work before being admitted to Weinstefan. So he sent me to some breweries in the Black Forest where I was doing my language course, and I knocked on doors until I found one that opened, and they couldn't offer me a job, but the brewmaster was sympathetic with my cause, and he helped me find a place. So I landed in Ulm, where I actually worked for a year and a half before going on then to Weinstefan. And part of Weinstefan back then was also that you had to speak the language. So I had my 2-month course, and then my internship time in the breweries, it gave me the language background I needed to study.
This was before the days when Siebel and Domans offered some sort of international program.
Correct,
with that. So you had to build the program yourself.
Right.
So you studied at Weinstefan. Where did you move after that?
Having spent then nearly 4 years in Germany, I thought it was time to see something different. And I'd always been very impressed by the Belgian beers, particularly the Trappists. And
Sure.
I worked as a student for one of the faculties, and they had a conference once, and there were some Belgian brewers there. And I just hit them up and asked them if they knew anything, how I could maybe work in Belgium. So I ended up during one of my spring breaks, which was a 2.5 month spring break, was able to go to Belgium and work for that time, see how the Belgians do it. And just as I finished Weinstefan a year later, I got a call from that brewery where I'd been, asking if I would be interested in the assistant brewmaster position. So I said yes, and I went to Mechelen. That's a little town, good-sized town, 80,000 people between Antwerp and Brussels.
Mm-hmm.
And this was about the time where Interbrew was founded, now later than InBev,
Right.
and now AB InBev. So the brewery that I was called Lamotte. It doesn't exist anymore, but that was part of the the early interbrew days. It had originally been a private brewery. It had been purchased by Bass, England, and was sold to the brewery Pied Boeuf, which makes the Pils brand Jupiler, which is now the major Pils brand in Belgium. So that's why we became part of this this joint venture between the two biggest Belgian breweries, Pied Boeuf and Stella Artois. So that was it was a great time for me because we were making Bass Pale Ale then under license, Bass Stout, and this was also a time when the Interbrew was buying up breweries all over Belgium. So small to mid-sized family breweries, so anywhere between 30 and 300,000 hectoliters, closing them down to get rid of the Pilsner brands, and but keeping the specialty beers and all the
buying
specialty
and drying.
Beers. Yeah, and all the specialty beers were going to La Motte. So I got in that time to brew Hoegaarden, Grand Cru, and Verboten Frucht, and Julius. Then 3 different Belgian-style pale ales, Ginderal, Horsale, and Vuitton. And then we took over Whitbread and Campbell, which was brewed at one of the breweries we closed. So Campbell's Scotch, McEwen's Stout. So McEwen's Christmas. So it was a good 500,000 hectoliter brewery, which had previously been primarily a Pilsner brewery.
What years were that?
That was 91 to 93.
Okay. I loved that era of McEwen's Scotch Ale.
Yeah. So it was fantastic education, getting these brands given to me and adapting them for the existing brewery, trying to meet the specs and the approval of the headquarters in Leuven.
Sure.
And so it was a huge learning curve. I learned a lot about hops and yeast. We used 23 different hop varieties, 8 different yeast varieties or yeast strains, making all these beers. And well, at that time, it was clear that they were going to close La Motte because they were building 2 brand new breweries, one in Leuven and one in Juppie, to house the 2 major brands, and they would have then additional capacity to take up the brands that we were brewing. So I decided to start looking for work in Bavaria to gain a little more experience.
Sure.
And ended up at a brewery about 35 kilometers up the road from Schönram as assistant head brewer, and this was a completely different world. It was going from 500,000 hectares, but all open fermentation, horizontal tanks in Mechelen to 70,000 hectoliters of classical Bavarian style beers. And I was there for 5.5 years and have moved from there to Schönram, where in 98 the head brewers, well, there was only one brewmaster at the time, I opened up, I applied and got the job, and there I am. So I'm finishing my 25th year starts in October.
That is incredible. And what a interesting and diverse background to end up back in Germany, brewing a much more limited palette of beers, but being able to focus so intently on improving that, and not just improving, but also maintaining the quality of this more limited palette of beers. Now that we're there at Schönram, I want to talk about the design of those beers, because of course, 24 years you've clearly put your thumbprint on the beers at the brewery and have taken some very specific approaches to the way that you now brew those beers. Before we do that, looking for innovation in your next beverage breakthrough, think outside the puree box and let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Even smoothie seltzers can benefit from the extra boost of flavor and color. Old Orchard is based in the greater Grand Rapids, Michigan area, also known as Beer City, USA, and supplies craft beverage categories ranging from beer, wine, and cider to seltzers, spirits, and kombucha. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, as craft beer's most trusted point-of-sale system, arrived as the mobile all-in-one solution you need to decrease service friction and increase guest satisfaction. With a full suite of craft-specific features, no contracts, and no monthly fees, Arrived provides the necessary tools to help your brewery grow. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. Remember, there is no I in arrived. And Arrived had some good news this week. They have acquired Craft Peak and are working on integrating e-commerce and their POS sales. Excited to see what they come up with next. So let's talk, Eric, about lager beer design. I imagine, so you come to Schönram 24 years ago, almost 25 now. What did the lagers, how have those beers changed over time? What did some of the core, say, Helles and Pilsner and Dunkel look like then? And what have you watched dynamically happen in the time since then?
Yeah, well, when I first got there, I realized that it's a very traditional area. Well, I knew that already from having been just up the road.
Sure.
Schönram was even more traditional than the brewery Stein, where I had been before, and also their customers or their drinkers or their fans were even more. It's hard to describe. Just stubborn Bavarians in terms of what they expect from
They
their
have
beer.
Expectations, right? And you had to keep delivering those expectations.
So I realized very quickly that the best way, the safest way to approach it was to do nothing first. I spent the first 1.5 years getting to know the entire system, so the brewery from front to back. All the pipes, all the hoses, all the tanks, all the fermenters, the whole kit. And because the day I started at the Stammtisch in the brewery tap, that evening, people at the Stammtisch were already complaining about the beer that since the new guy started, it's changed.
Even if it was beer in tanks, long before you got there, your sheer presence there was going to make it worse, right?
Right. So I realized I was going to have to stay a bit. And of course, I never thought it would be nearly 25 years. I still had the intent of coming back here and starting my own place. And at some point, I just, that train left the station. Unfortunately for my parents, they wished that I had come back here. And of course, now seeing beer in Wyoming, this was the place I wanted to come back to.
It's not too late.
I know. But
if you want to come back to Cheyenne and make lagers, none of us are going to complain.
Okay. Well, you never know. Never say never.
It's a retirement plan.
So I realize it's going to be at least 5 years, if not more. But so I took the very slow approach, and that had the effect that that information was disseminated into our drinkers or our fans by my brewers, because people would quiz them and put them on the spot and say, so what has the new guy done? What has he changed? And they could honestly say nothing. He's left the beers alone. So it took about 3 months for the dust to settle. And people accepted the fact. It wasn't so much the fact that I'm American, because I had been known, people knew me. I mean, there is a high density of breweries in that area of Southeast Bavaria, but I had a somewhat of a name, and people knew that I was a normal guy.
You were part of that. You were Team Bavaria. You were not going to rip these apart and try to rebuild.
And I adapted the local dialects, so I really tried to fit in and blend in with the locals. And there's a saying. It's initially when I was hired, people would ask, so where's the new guy from? And my boss would say, Übersee. Übersee is the name of a town about 30 kilometers down the road, a local town near us, but it's also the German word for across the ocean. So he wasn't lying. So, and when they found out, it's him, the American, people swallowed a bit maybe, and then they said, well, Hauptsache, which is Bavarian for main thing, not a Northern German, so not a Prussian. So it was
better an American.
Yeah, better an American than somebody from the north of Germany. So and being from Wyoming, it's a rural area. We're mountain people. We're outdoorsy people, as are the the Bavarians. So I felt very much at home, and I think that the Wyoming mentality is very similar to the Bavarian mentality. We just want to be left alone, want to enjoy the nature we have right in front of us, and tend to have an earthy or even scatological sense of humor, and I have all that. So that's
you fit right in.
So I fit right into that mentality. But I did start tweaking the beers gradually, specifically. Luckily, my predecessor was a stickler. We had open fermenters when I arrived. He had built new open top fermenters to replace some older ones, and he was very particular about that detail. He was not so particular about duration of lagering, or so particular about decoction mash, and he was a guy. He's in his 80s now. He was he grew up in a time when there was a quantum leap from whole leaf hops to hop extract. So when hop strainers were being disbanded in favor of whirlpools, pellets had come out, and brewers quickly found that nobody had engineered a whirlpool properly. So with all the problems they were having, shortly after the implementation of whirlpools in many breweries, started using extract to reduce the load on the whirlpool. So he was of the old school who had made that quantum leap from hop strainer to whirlpool. So he'd gone from whole leaf hops to pellets plus extract, and he was using about 60 to 65% extract. So I still had some old contracts that I had to use up. It took me a couple of years to get rid of that. And that was about also the same time we had to start putting that on the label. So you have to put on the label Wasser Malz Hopfen, so water malt hops. And if you're using extract, you have to put Hopfen Extract. So, and extract to Germans sounds like chemicals,
right,
or artificial. So when that law was passed and we had to put it on the label, we were still using up some of the extract contracts. So I had a lot of explaining to do to our drinkers.
Right, you hadn't changed anything. This was what it was, and we're gonna
yeah. But so and it was also against my philosophy, and I re-engineered the whirlpool. Luckily, my predecessor, he built this whirlpool, so it had the right surface area. It had enough area to capture the load using 100% pellets hops, but I had to change some of the piping, the angle of the inlet, the diameter of the inlet, the speed. Added a frequency converter to the pump so that I could adjust the pump speed at knockout. So it was just more of a matter of tweaking the engineering and the fluid mechanics of the whirlpool to get that to work properly. So eventually got rid of the extract, and at the same time was through my experience in Belgium. We were using hops from Slovenia, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia back then, Czech Republic, Germany, England, Belgium. I think I didn't leave anything out. So we were using hops from all these countries, different varieties, and I recognized in Belgium the difference that the hop variety can make, or the hop terroir, or it's the country of its origin, it can make on the flavor of the beer and the aroma. So I started
consistency is your goal,
and consistency.
Right.
Yeah. So I really started looking at the hop in a method, in a way to express the flavor of our beer. So going away, we were using Brewer's Gold at the time, which was very common in Germany about that time. So Brewer's Gold extract, Tradition, and Perle. Eventually got rid of the Brewer's Gold and the Perle. Tradition is still one of my main hops. And branched out. We had some Hersbrucker as well. And since then we branched out. We've kept Tradition, Hersbrucker, and have picked up Saphir, Hallertau, Mittelfrüh, Tettnanger, and then some of the newer varieties, Mandarina Bavaria, Calista, Ariana, and some very rare varieties that are grown in Tettnang from one of my farmers. They're actually originally French land varieties, so Petit Blanc and Tardif de Bourgogne. And don't think I've left anything out. Hallertau Mittelfrüh, if I mentioned that. I like to use those from Hallertau and Tettnang because the Tettnanger Mittelfrüh is very different than from the Hallertau Mittelfrüh. And the combination is what does it.
The combination.
Yeah, so it's the fruity, citrusy lemon character from Tettnang and more of the piney, light pine floral character that you get from the Hallertau.
So as you mentioned, you use these hops and these newer varieties. How are you employing those within the beers that you make? Are these going in small amounts into existing beers, or do you design new lager beers with some of these hops in mind?
Well, when we're doing seasonals or one-offs, I will often use a single variety. Just for many years, well, I'm still doing it. Actually, we have our Christmas beer, which is actually a classical Märzen. It's about 650 hectoliters a year. We brew it in August to be served starting the first Sunday of Advent. So it gets a good 10 weeks of lagering, even more a little bit, depending on when Advent starts, but sure. Somewhere between 10 and 11 and a half weeks in the cellar. And that's a 14 Plato big Märzen using Vienna malt, sort of the way Märzen beer used to be. And I've gone through all those varieties with that beer over the course of the years, and it's always single hopped. I've done it with Mandarine Bavaria. I've done it with 36 BUs. I've done it with 18 BUs. Tried a bit of everything. So people look forward to that beer because they know it's going to be different every year. And 3 years running, I did it with Tettnang from the same farm, but from a different lot. So it's that's one way to play with the varieties. With our flagship beer is the Helles. That makes up 80% of our sales, and people expect consistency. Reliable consistency. They don't want any experimentation. So I blend 4 different varieties for that. So it's always tradition. Spalte Select, that's one I forgot to mention. I was missing one. Spalte Select, Hersbrucker, and Saphir. Actually, right now I'm blending Hallertau Mittelfrüh into it. So I'm using 5 hops at the moment. And I did about a year and a half where I had a little bit too much of Mandarine Bavaria, and was also using that. It's all hot side, so if you use it early enough, it does very well in a Helles.
Without an aromatic pickup there.
Right.
But that, because hops are an agricultural product, there is some variance from year to year based on how that harvest looks. If that blend allows you to, allows you to adjust for various characters, right, yeah, and whatnot that might happen in that. What does that process look like for you? How do you then approach thinking about that blend, knowing that maintaining that consistency is your goal? You go into hop selection then, and you are selecting these hops and thinking about them, and then figuring out how does that process look as you then start to develop what that blend might look like as you move on for the new season of hops.
Right. It's I always go to selection. I spend a lot of my time in the hop yards during the harvest, and then we'll select on pre-harvest. So just smelling, sniffing things just before they're picked. I already think that might be what I want, and then seeing how it comes out of the kiln. So it's a lot of sniffing and rubbing and getting into it. And so for each variety, I have a particular desired character, desired aroma. I'm not, it was Dave Grinnell from Boston Brewing Company said, selecting hops is not a beauty competition. So, they don't have to look great. I mean, they shouldn't be horribly damaged or diseased or full of one disease or another. But a little bit of damage actually helps to, improve the aroma or the alpha acid, because it's a reaction of the hop plant to
A little bit of that stress.
to a stress situation. Yeah. So I have a particular desirable characteristic for each variety that I try to reselect every year.
How do you articulate what that is? And how do you lock that? I mean, it's living somewhere in your brain. Does that live in a language, or does that? How would you describe some of those characters that you are looking for?
Yeah, there are just a few like bullet points for each variety that I'm looking for. So when I take my assistant with me, or I'll take an apprentice, so I tell them this is what I want, or what I think is right for our beer. And tradition was bred to emulate Hallertau Mittelfrüh. Problem was it was Mittelfrüh then as now is a very it's very susceptible to weather, and so you'll have alphas anywhere between 2 and 5% or even more. This last year was 5.5%. On the average, it's around 4% over 10 years. So, the tradition was bred so that it would emulate the character of Hallertau Mittelfrüh, which it does pretty well. It's sort of like the Centennial is to the Cascade, sort of a more of a higher alpha variety of that, with a more reliable yields and reliably higher alpha acid content. So I'm looking for that. It has a light citrus floral character, a little bit of pine in the background from the tradition. The Hesbrucke often has combination of orange marmalade and lavender. Safia has a bit of lemongrass and mango. These are little background. The German hops are all very herbal and floral and piney, but these it's more like the nuances in the background.
Right. We're not talking about this in hazy IPA terms where it's very easily digestible and understandable as that thing. These are overtones, undertones, very, very small subtleties.
Spalte Select is also, it has almost a sweet aroma that can go toward pina colada. It can have a little bit of coconut, a little bit of pineapple, but at the same time, it's very classic. Tettnang, there are two different sort of tracks of Tettnang, you could say. There's the more earthy, spicy variety. And there are very many different clones of Tettnang. So there's the earthy spicy, and then there's the light lemon zest. And I'm always looking for the lemon zest. I like the spice, but I like the lemon zest more. So that's very dependent upon terroir and where it's grown.
On something like the Hell, what do those additions then look like on the hot side? And, we're not going to talk about anything else because there isn't anything else, right?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about traditional German lager brewing and not whirlpooling and dry hopping or massive amounts.
Yeah, it could be that if I'm using 4 varieties, I'm using 5 right now, but I'm using 5 varieties right now, but they're actually 8 different lots. So 3 of those varieties are from 2 different harvests. So I can have as many as 3 harvests of one variety. So theoretically, with 4, I could have as many as 12 different lots that I put into that. So you phase in the previous year,
right,
or the current year as you're phasing out the previous. And if I maybe overdid it or really liked a certain lot, I might have a little more. We have our forward contracts, but I will. If it's a particularly good year, I'll just, if I say there's so and so many bales from this yard, my contract says I take 8,000 kilos, but if there's 9,000 kilos, I'll take the rest. So I might have a little bit more than I need. So that's why I can get into 3 years. But so that'll be a small part of that variety as it's being phased out then. So I'm always phasing in and out. A couple times a year, I'll do single brew batches of Helles with one variety, and I'll put that into the lager tank separate. And I'll do that same thing with, maybe Tradition and Select one year, the next year with Hesbrucke and Safia, just for me to kind of dial myself into it again. So I'll take 15-liter kegs off of those. We have these tall kegs. They're kind of like the sixtels here. And I'll trickle those off when the beer is finished. I mean, when it's at the end of its maturation period. And let it settle for a couple of days because it drops pretty bright. If it's already reached 5 weeks in maturation, you let it drop then in this keg for another week. It's pretty bright. And then I put those two next to each other. So the regular Helles, just taken off the one of our tanks, and the single varietal Helles, just to get a feel of what that variety does for the beer. And if I've had bad years, I've actually if it's been a very bad poor harvest of one particular variety, and that happens because of it's a 4-week period of the hops the harvest. So you might have rainy, nasty weather, or it's been too cold and the hops aren't quite where they should be. But near the end of harvest, when some of the later varieties come up, you get them at the right moment. So I'll tend to then reduce the amount of those varieties that didn't perform so well or didn't come out so well from that harvest. And so I'm able to adjust the percentage of each of those varieties from year to year. And then, of course, in the end, because we're not looking for much aroma, I mean, we want aroma, but in the end, so I'm always dosing according to alpha acid. That being followed by analyses, we can do our own bittering units. So looking at the bittering units as compared to just the sensory perception, and what I usually adjust then is it's just the time that I add it. So I might start a little bit later in the boil or a little bit earlier, but I spread it out over there's 3 editions for the Helles, for example. The last edition being 10 minutes before the end of boil.
Have you done any kind of profiling of your preferred hops, in terms of trying to build a profile of what it is, from a GC mass spec, kind of component level of those? I know that that's happening more often these days, especially with larger breweries, trying to select from those hops that are within a range that they want for that kind of consistency, or do you still kind of prefer the sensory method?
So far, it's just been sensory. That's something I would like to do, and that's something we've talked about in the frame of maybe not necessarily a dissertation, but a master's thesis or something. But
find a good student that might want to do that for you, and
right, yeah, because we're only the big breweries have
sure. A lot of resources involved.
Have the resources, the laboratory capacity to do that, and if you have it done, and it's not in the course of some research project that's maybe accompanied by the faculty in Weinstefan, it gets pretty expensive pretty fast. So
I imagine. Well, that's interesting to talk about hops. I want to talk about fermentation because as you've mentioned, we've talked about you practice open fermentation and with your lager beers. Before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brew house to the integrated hop backs on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brew houses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented working with world-renowned industry veterans and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. So I mentioned I want to talk about open top fermentation, but I think we should actually back up from that and talk about mash strategy, decoction, and in that process. You mentioned earlier on that as you moved into the brewery, that the prior brewmaster had a more flexible approach to decoction. Talk to me about Schönram's approach to decoction, how that varies between the beers that you make, or if it varies between the various beers that you make, and in your work, how you have found it actually impacts the beers that you make with the malt that you use for those.
Yeah, so that starts with the barley variety. It's not only the hops that I'm looking at, but also the barley variety. And we purchase all of our barley through 4 local family-owned maltings in Bavaria. Unfortunately, they're also influenced by the world market and the current situation. Contracting barley, forward contracting I've always done that, but not this far in advance. We're going to harvest 24 already, and we're looking at paying twice, even 2024 that we were paying last year. So it's not only, it's also looking at the terroir of the barley and where that's grown. And I try to spread the risk among Bavaria, around Bavaria. So we have Franconian barley, we have barley from the Oberpfalz, we have barley from Lower Bavaria and from Upper Bavaria, and also part of Bavarian Swabia. So by doing so,
how does the terroir on those barley farms differ, and what can you really sense in that? I'm curious about this, because especially with something that goes through such a rigorous malting process, where is that sensory level and threshold, and how much difference do you actually perceive between those?
It's well, at the moment, a lot of it is the barley breeding programs they're going after yield, because the barley price has been going down for years. Right. Now it's of course completely different with the current world situation, but I was always looking for varieties with lower yield, because the lower yields I thought gave more flavor. The corns tended to be fuller, the husks tended to be thinner, and with the higher yield varieties, you have, in the end, a lot more husk, a lot more potential for polyphenol, for tannins coming out of the barley, but also
you're getting heavier barley, but it's not necessarily what you need out of that barley.
Yeah, and they have a deeper color. I'm always looking for the brightest possible color, and barleys that grow in higher areas, so higher elevation, that are harvested later if the weather's right. Unfortunately, it's the case that if it's a good hop year, it's usually a bad barley year, and the other way around. But the barleys from a little bit higher elevations through the being harvested later often have an advantage in that they have fuller endosperm. They tend to have lower protein, a little bit lower protein, so they don't get as dark, and it gives the beer, you get more extract out of it, more juiciness.
Juiciness.
Yeah.
That's what you're looking for in your lager barley.
And I tell the maltsters, please leave the mashing to me. I don't like over modified barley malt. So we pursue single step infusion up to a certain temperature, which at some point, depending on the
so with this, are they then custom malting the malt to your specification?
To an extent, it depends. We have two of our maltings can do that. Two of them not so easily, but then we're just more picky. We won't take everything, and we always get an analyses up front. And because of the good relationships we have, and because of the fact that we've been working with the same maltings for well over 2 decades now, so they know what I want, and they know that I'm also not afraid to send a truck back or to make a phone call, an irritating phone call the minute I've mashed in or at least started lautering and have identified problems. So I'm not shy to complain. I'm always very polite, and but I always rather than complain behind their backs, I call them immediately and tell them, so they know I'm a bit sensitive and picky and meticulous, so they pay better attention. It actually works pretty well.
The squeaky wheel gets the oil.
There you go. So so with all of our beers, we do we start with a multiple step infusion, which at some point is then arrested by drying off a portion for decoction. The decocted portion will also undergo a slight step infusion before we actually boil. We're at about 1,300 feet, 1,400 feet in Schönram elevation, so we boil at about 98.5 C, which is somewhere, I don't know, 205 or I don't know. So the infusion part of the mash, the steps and the temperatures and which temperatures and the time, the duration of each rest will depend on the year and on the beer. I have some
on the year,
on the harvest
Right.
the harvest year. Yeah.
how much does that vary, and how do you make the decisions about how to change that?
That varies a lot, and we brewers made the mistake. I don't know how long ago. The winemakers went down the right path, telling everybody it's a natural product, and it changes every year. It's supposed to.
Right.
And some idiot in marketing many decades ago told consumers beer always tastes the same. So we're all stuck with that. And of course, that's what a lot of the big breweries propagated for many years, this reliable consistency. So the consumers are a bit schizophrenic. They want reliable consistency year in and year out, but they also want a natural product. So, and unlike wine, which has the grape, we are dealing with barley and hops, or sometimes multiple grains and hops. And as I mentioned, usually if it's a good hop year, it's a bad barley year, or not so good barley year. Or especially if it's a fantastic hop year, it's usually a bad barley year. So we're always dealing with these two clashing factors. So we have two things that don't quite match up
Right.
agriculturally that we're dealing with. So
how do those steps then change, depending on the barley harvest?
well, we won't get the first new harvest into the brewery until about mid-November, say, and mid-November to mid-December. So we have, with each of our maltsters, agreed to a regimen of blending old new variety,
Right.
old variety, or the previous harvest, or actually blending the new harvest into the previous harvest. So it goes up in increments of 10%. So 10%, 20, and so on.
And that comes from the maltster then blended with the prior year, and then the percentage of the
Right.
new harvest malt.
Right. And what we do, though, is we, at some point, that's usually in January, we will take, when we're still blending, we will then take a load of all new harvest and make 5 brews back to back with just that, and put that into a dedicated tank, but follow that analytically and sensorically. So we will follow it, through the fermentation, apparent, so final extract, apparent degree of fermentation, color. It also has an effect on how the yield of the hops and that, and then the flavor perception. And sometimes you have a year, you got to live with what you got, and you make the best of it. But with that, then I can dial in the mash. So I start changing the mash. So I'll do those 5 brews back to back. And then 5 days later, after I see what's going on, I'll brew another 5 brews back to back with that single new harvest, and with a different mash. So try to dial in the mash there before I get to the point where at some point I just have 100% new harvest. So that's usually about when I'm into about 30 to 40% of new harvest blended in, then I'll start doing the single new harvest batches just to get a feel for it. Sometimes, there are years, there's nothing you can do about it. It's the color's what it is. It's too dark or it's too light. We even had, this was 2003, very low color years, and I always go for varieties that have low colors anyway. Marte, Barque Marte, or they're older varieties that have low colors. And so I'm looking for a final beer color in the Hellas of 5 EBC, if possible, 4.8. So as pale as possible. And the cool thing is that very pale color, but all that flavor. But we've actually had people, I think 2003 was, complaining that the beer was watery, and it was just, the sensory profile and analytically it was right on target, but it was just a very pale year. And then you get years where it gets almost into fest beer color, but there's nothing you can do about it. We don't decoct that long, so it's not like I'm getting a lot of it. It's not like a Czech Pils where you're doing triple decoction and forever.
Right.
You're getting a lot of color. I don't want the color.
How long would a decoction typically last?
Anywhere from 30 seconds to 10 minutes, 15 minutes max. Usually it's somewhere, so what I'll do, like with the Helles, I'll take it up to boil for 30 seconds, and shut off the steam and let it sit for 5 minutes. So it's actually, the mash is actually being boiled for 30 seconds.
Does that, with such a short, intense decoction, have a really sensorially impactful effect on the beer? I mean, why go to the trouble of doing that if it's such a small thing?
Yeah, it doesn't have an effect. So on the you don't get the maltiness.
You're not driving a Maillard reaction, and
right. I don't want the malty flavor coming out. Primarily, at least with the pale beers, the Helles, the Pils, the Fest beer, the intent of the decoction is to do the mechanical exploding of starch molecules, which after you get above 85 C, that's already happening, and then you take that up to boiling, let it sit for a bit. Those molecules are being, just through the heat, they're popping and being blown apart, and then when you bring that back into the mash, the rest of the mash, it's anywhere between 62 and 67 C. That's also dependent on the beer and the year, the harvest year. Then you get a conversion, a better conversion. So the decoction for me is more, it does something for the body, but what it does is it allows you to get, for the gravity that we're brewing at, to get higher alcohol contents. You get a higher apparent attenuation. So you're actually lowering the final or residual extract, but the alcohol is imparting a sweetness in a body. Alcohol adds body and sweetness to the beer. I always compare it to the fat in a pork roast, just without the fat. The fat gives it the sweetness and the body and the mouthfeel, and that's what the alcohol does, even at these low levels. You don't get the alcoholic burn, but you do get a mouthfeel and a body from that.
Are there circumstances or beers where you add to that decoction strategy and run multiple decoctions?
Well, up to this point, we have not been able to do that. We've been using the lauder tun as a holding vessel. So we will take we were taking 2/3 of the mash into the lauder tun, let it sit, and using the mash tun to do the decoction. But we've bought and installed and commissioned, just in the last couple months, a dedicated mash cooker. So now I have the capacity to go back and forth and really play with that. So
So more decoctions are coming for
more
Schönram.
decoctions are coming. Yeah, I really want to try that with the Dunkles or even with the wheat beer.
We'll have to follow up at some point in the future and see where those experiments have taken you. Yeah. So we go through this mash step mash program, which changes every year, and obviously a single decoction is a part of this. Are there any other elements to this this mash and lauder process that you find impart a distinctly Schönram kind of approach, or that are just critical to what you do?
The lauder is pretty standard. I mean, the lauder ton is is very well dimensioned, so it doesn't take me. I have a runoff of about an hour and 20 minutes, just the actual runoff time. I do a continuous raking at a very low speed, but it's perceptible, but I would say it's almost imperceptible. So just barely cutting while we're laudering. And to speed things up, I like to, for as long as possible, not start heating the wort in the kettle, because that also helps raise your apparent attenuation, final attenuation. So, and with the Pils, I won't start heating the wort until it's all been collected. But in the interest of saving time, with the Helles, for example, I start heating up at the second sparge. Ideally, I wouldn't heat that up until the end either. But that also allows the enzymes that are they're pretty weak and they're struggling, but they're still doing something.
Yeah. As you,
and then, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, then we've got a boil, being at the elevation we're at, it's not that high. It's not like Cheyenne here at 6,000 feet, but you still, I still have to do a 5% evaporation to ensure that I don't have any DMS problems. And we have a pressure phase. So we actually close the flue on the chimney of the kettle and take the temp. Well, actually, we do it on pressure, but it gets up to about 105 C because we're usually boiling at 98.5.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as we hit that, which converts to about 160 millibar, we turn off the steam. And so that just speeds up the reaction rate of the breakdown of the precursive DMS, so that when we open up the flue after we do this, so we hold that, then we just hold it. And as soon as it stops boiling, the wort, the pressure goes down and the temperature goes down, but it's still a hyper-heated wort at that
above
point.
Boiling temperature, right?
Right. So that total is about heating up, so closing the flue, heating up, holding, and then we do a gradual release over a bypass to make sure that, because otherwise if you open the flue and start boiling again, you'll shoot wort out the chimney. So we wait till we get down to about 10 millibar and then we'll start boiling again. And that that allows me to boil at 5% evaporation rate and not have any DMS issues. That's very important because DMS can really,
that can ruin the experience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Sure. How long do you typically boil for? And obviously, this is not really time driven. It's much more driven by the percentage of evaporation.
65 minutes.
Yeah.
That's about it. Yeah.
Sure. So then let's talk about how you move into fermentation after that. Like you mentioned at the top, it's all open top fermenters.
Correct. Yeah.
And so you knock out and you cool down. And what does that next part of the process look like for you?
Yeah. So we look at the yeast to help the viability of the yeast. We calculate pitching rates.
Which yeast strain do you use?
It's a house strain. It's probably originally a 3470, but a
lot of them are.
Yeah. So it's under our name in the yeast bank, and but it's most probably a 3470. But it does very well. It stays in suspension long enough, but settles out pretty bright. Don't have any problems with diacetyl, and if it's a good wort, then it's pretty quick. So we pitch it about 18 million cells. We give it we start at 6 to 6.5 C. In the summer we can't pitch as cold because we just can't get the cold liquor down that far, and then but let it free rise up to 9.5, and let it almost end ferment. It doesn't quite end ferment. And after about 6 to 7 days, we gradually cool it down. I mean, at some point, it starts kind of dropping on its own. Then we'll take it over 36 to 48 hours down to 3.5 C, and then get most of the yeast out of suspension. And then we'll rack that off into lagering. And as we're racking it off, blending into the line, we're blending in Kreuzen. So we use Kreuzen all of our beers with Helles, and it's Helles. It's about 36 hours into fermentation. So it's about 7% then of the total volume of the tank, and that brings in enough viable, healthy active yeast and residual sugar or extract to give us the carbonation we need.
The pictures that are in this story that Joe took of you are
pretty pornographic.
It's worth, if you're a brewer out there, you want to, if you're a subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, dive back into the archives that are included in Access with every subscription. Go find that lager issue from 2020, and the photos of the open top fermenters at high Kreuzen are just absolutely gorgeous. And but talk to me about like in terms of efficiency. Closed tanks are certainly going to provide you with a more secure environment. They're going to and there are techniques that you could use in that way to get close to what you do with open top fermenters without some of those drawbacks. What, from a conceptual level, what do you find about open top fermentation with a lager yeast in that kind of 3470 family that provides a different flavor or sensory experience over, say, a more closed current technical approach to fermentation?
Well, the first step of that is to have a proper geometry. So you have a big surface area relative to the volume, so open surface area. We have about 1-to-1.
But why?
That big surface area allows the beer, as there's a German verb. I mean, I don't know. You can invent words in German. So it's ausstinken, so to stink out. So that, this big surface area allows a lot of the unwanted volatiles to escape into the atmosphere and come out of the beer. It also gives a big surface area for the sort of the hop resins, proteins, dead yeast cells, all that crap you don't want in the beer. It gets driven up by the process, by the convection, by the CO2 that comes to the surface, and you can skim that off. If you allow that to be sort of drawn back into the beer, which happens because of the convection and because of that, so it'll be pushed to the top, but at some point it gets pulled back in. And with as the ethanol content goes up or climbs gradually, it also leaches more and more. A perceptible cloying bitterness back into the beer. So by having that come up, being able to skim that off, being able to really see, and you get islands of it. You get just islands of crap, in the vessel. You can just go in there with the slotted spoon or the vacuum and suck that or pull that out. So skimming the heads. And it also allows you to really judge the clarity of the beer. Our Helles looks in the fermenter when it's really dropped, the yeast has dropped out to where we want it. We say schwarz, black. It's not quite black, but it's dark brown. So looks dark brown in the vessel. And if it's yellow looking or straw looking, then there's still too much yeast in suspension. I mean, you can draw samples off and do yeast counts of that, look at it under the microscope, but that's a very local phenomenon that you're getting out of a sampling valve. So by looking at the whole surface area, you can really see the clarity or how much yeast is actually falling out. So we don't want to bring too much yeast from there into secondary or maturation or lagering. There's those three terms are the same thing. So the more yeast we can drop out, the better it is then later for the character of the beer, because we like to leave the beer in lagering as long as possible. I mean, we have a minimum, where we had a minimum lagering time after primary fermentation. So with free rise, with holding the temperature, with dropping the temperature, holding it cold before racking off, we're talking 9 to 10 days in primary. Rack it off, and then we had our sort of the limit where we said we would go to in the summer, because in the summer we sell 30% more beer on average than we do.
Right.
So if you look at the year,
speed it up, make more of it faster. Yeah.
Yeah. If we look at the yearly average, you take the hectoliter divided by 12. We're selling 30% more than the average than we are all year long.
Right.
But so that means in January you're selling, maybe you're 70% of the average.
Right.
So there are huge fluctuations. The Bavarians are outdoor drinkers. They like to drink outdoors, and the nicer the weather, the more they drink. They love to sit in the beer gardens and that. I don't quite get it. I tend to drink almost less in the summer than I do in the winter if it gets too hot.
Sure.
But the trend is to drink much more. So from May till September, it's a very high volume. So our lagering cellar capacity is set up for that. So in the summer, we always had problems with getting too short on our lagering time. So we had the limit of 28, but COVID, 28 days. So 4 weeks. COVID showed us that we had, at some point when we had the first lockdown and then second lockdown, we had too much beer in lagering. And it took us a while to finally, to dial that in, and had to reduce things in the brew house. But
but hey, you got to lager your beer a little bit longer.
In Germany, the case was every week they had a press conference. You didn't know, are we opening up again? Are we not? So it was very hard to. I mean, at some point, everybody switched to home drinking and just said, "Screw it." And at some point, actually, consumption went up massively. So we got rid of all of our old stock, so to speak. But
your extra lagered stuff.
Yeah. So we had stuff with 70 days, which is perfect for a stronger beer like the Märzen and that. For the Helles, it starts to suffer, I would say. At 70 days, that was a bit old. But it was perfectly fine at 60, and it's 56 days. And actually, perfection is about 42 days for the Helles. So we've raised our minimum lagering period now to 35 days. So we've increased our lagering capacity, but we've also raised the bar. So that gives us...
What makes it that ideal, 40... Why is that the ideal time for you? I mean, and I certainly have spoken to many brewers who have different opinions on this, and some are of the longer it lagers, the better it gets kind of, approach, and there are others where... now you are saying that that's not true for you, that there's some other elements to that beer that you enjoy with less lagering time to it.
Yeah. So the first 2 weeks, we rack the fermented, nearly unfermented beer off at about 3C. The Kreuzen comes into that at about 9.5. We set the temperature in the tank at 4C, and we keep it there for two weeks. So that's where we get most of our carbonation. We come into the lagering tank with about, because we're fermenting cold, we come in with about 3.5 grams of CO2. So it's not like we need a lot. But the thing is if you go below 7% Kreuzen, it's kind of a sluggish secondary. So 7% is just perfect. If you go up to 10%, it could be that you have too much residual because you just haven't fermented everything that you brought in through the Kreuzen. So we already need 2 weeks at 4C to make sure that we get that natural carbonation. You also get a nice little wash of the beer, drives out additional unwanted volatiles that may have not been driven off in secondary. It's kind of and because of the convection going on in the tank, it's a good washing of the beer, I would say. And then we gradually start to cool that down, and that takes about a week. So that's already 3 weeks. And then we have a period of esterification. So you have all these organic acids being brought in that are have been produced during fermentation, but also come in through the raw materials, reacting with not only ethanol but other higher carbon alcohols to create esters. And for ester formation, you need time. And then there's the factor of yeast secretion. So the yeast starts secreting peptides, so lower chain peptides, that add to body, mouthfeel, and a perception of mellowness to the beer. And you've talked to Yvon de Batz. This is also something that he talks about.
Sure.
He lagers his ales. To give them the proper mellowness that he wants. So that's 5 weeks is, say, for a low gravity Helles is perfect. Although we find that the 6 or 7 weeks are even better. And the pills, we will not go under 6 weeks. And we have a beer called Gold, which is like it's a fest fest beer. It's a high gravity export. It's about 13.5 Platos. It's actually like a Wiesenmärzen, you could say, similar to the Oktoberfest. And that's just no good under 8 weeks. It's got to have 8 weeks. And the dark, actually, the Dunkel, also a COVID thing. We had some of that stuff that was 100 days in lagering, and poof, I was getting very bourbony and vanilla just for the esterification process. And then, of course, so you have the geometry in the fermenters. So we don't go above 4 meters of height. That's also a stress thing for the yeast. And by having open top fermenters, you certainly don't have any additional overpressure that would add to the potential stress of the yeast.
Right.
Because then the yeast is secreting other things into the beer that you don't want that are going to affect the flavor. But in the maturation, then we also have that. We have some, it's because of the brewery and the cellars that we have. I mean, the brewery goes back to 1780, so some things you just can't change too easily.
Sure.
But we have some, and to get the maximum volumes out of those cellars, we put in standing tanks, so vertical tanks that they're dish bottom tanks. They're not cylinder conical with a steep cone on it. So dish bottom tanks, and we'll have the highest tank we have is 4 meters. My favorite tanks are horizontals because I get the best clarification there. If you just look at the, it's a giant rectangle as opposed to a cylinder.
Yeah.
So, standing cylinder. If you lie it down, it's a rectangle. So you have a big surface area. The yeast settles out much better. But it's the same thing. In the secondary fermentation, you don't stress the yeast because you have a little bit of an oat. You're worried about 0.3, 0.4 bar, which is 5 psi, 5 to 7 psi overpressure on the tank. But because they're not, terribly tall, right, the yeast is not stressed there as well, and you get a much better clarification. So we like to be heading to the filter coming out of lagering at about 10 EBC. I mean, once we get above 20, it's of turbidity. We know that the filter run is not going to be as long as it could be.
Right.
So we're, if you look at, we have a plate and frame DE filter. It's set up to do officially, according, if you look at the papers of the filter, we could do 1,200 hectoliters in one run, and we get as much as 1,700 hectoliters, sometimes even 2,000 we've done, but that gets a bit dangerous because we don't want to overdo it, but easily 1,800 hectoliters through that. So we're getting about 40 to 50% more out of the filter or out of each run than we could just because of the way we work.
Yeah. We're getting on in time here, but I want to come back to the subject of water. Water is something we haven't talked about yet, but it's certainly a crucial piece of this in terms of the way the yeast works and the way that hops express and what talk to me about the character of your water and what you do to that and some of the parameters around that lead to the beer quality that you're looking for.
We have actually it's very similar to the Munich water that was common when Munich beer became popular. So it's water, runoff water from the Alps into the aquifers. So it's very high in calcium carbonate, calcium bicarbonate, not high in magnesium, but a lot of carbonates really. So not much in the way of chloride or sulfates. So it's primarily calcium and bicarbonate in that. So we do a process where we split as we're coming into our water treatment. We split the stream of water into 3 streams. The smallest stream, which is about 8% of the total, we will run through a vessel that is full of calcium hydroxide. So it's supersaturated calcium hydroxide solution. So it's just we get calcium hydroxide anhydrate and mix that with water and pump that into this vessel. So that supersaturates, that little stream supersaturates with that calcium hydroxide milk. We call it Milch, Kalzium Milch. And it goes, overflows into the reactor where we take 2/3 of the total and that has about a pH of around 13 to 14, so it's very alkaline.
Mm-hmm.
And there you get a reaction, and we have a forced path. It has to go down a tube to the bottom of the vessel, which has a conical bottom, and it has a forced flow down this tube and up. And in this time, you get a reaction of the calcium hydroxide with solution with the hardness of the water, and you get a sedimentation, a precipitation. That settles out in the cone, and that overspills then into a third vessel where we take the remaining. What did I say? So it's 2/3, 10%, so about 30%, a little less, 25% of the remaining of the full volume that we blended. That brings the pH back down, but you have a continuous precipitation. So we were able to take that alpine water down to, so it's ppm is always hard for me to, because we're always looking at hardness, degrees of hardness. So off the top of my head, but we take it down to about 5 degrees of German hardness. So from 19 to 20 degrees German hardness down to 5. Very low residual alkalinity. It's not Pilsner style water, but it's getting there. So it's very, very soft water then. And that, before it goes into the water, the brewing water tank goes over a sand filter to just get out any particles that have not sedimented out. So it's a very, say, non-invasive way.
Yeah.
We don't have to add any acids or any chemicals or any other chemicals. We don't have to use any or much electricity. It comes just water coming off. At pressure, we reduce the pressure down to 2.5 bar, run it through the decarbonation plant, and then off into the water tank. So it's a simple, primitive, actually old-fashioned way of doing that. And you can only really do that with that kind of alpine high carbonate hardness water.
Sure. That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, and that allows us to make the paler beers. I mean, when the brewery was founded, it was, that whole area was brown beer territory. So we were a brown beer brauerei. So brown is a dunkles, and that was all we made because we didn't treat the water.
Right.
Because of the dark malt, that helps to bring down the acidity of the mash and the acidity of the wort. So it does well, that kind of high carbonate water does well with dark beers or wheat beers. Wheat beers don't care either, but it doesn't do well with pale beers. They get a very harsh, cloying bitterness there's really nothing you can do to change it. It's just the water profile. So by softening it like that, and then that's what actually paved the way, say around 18. So Pilsners came out in 1842. It took it a while for the hype to reach Munich back then. It was,
right.
It was in 1895, I believe, that Spaten was the first brewery in Bavaria to make that style of beer, sort of emulating the Pilsner style, but they weren't decarbonating their water. So they had to really bring the hop character down, or the hop additions down, to not make it too cloying. And that's actually how Helles became a style. It's the Bavarian attempt to making a Pils, but compromising on the hopping rates based on their water. So, and they were even afraid to sell that stuff locally. They exported it to the north of Germany, and it was only when the chic folks of Munich said, we want that beer too, that they started selling it locally. And we didn't really get onto Helles until the mid 1950s. I think the first Helles we made was in 1954.
That's a great segue to ask you about this question. As I was drinking your Helles this past weekend, I was noticing that, compared to what an American idea of Helles might be, it was considerably more bitter, that there was more structure to it, that, and I think Americans this happens in both directions. A European idea of American IPA gets conditioned by what happens when a beer sits on a boat, for months at a time to get across an ocean, and what you then taste, is different than how it tastes when it's fresh. And the same thing happens to Americans drinking Helles from Germany or Pilsner from Germany or Czech, that what we get by the time it sits on a boat for a few months is not the same beer as it is when it's fresh. But it was an interesting one tasting that this weekend and thinking, that's these beers can be these things. And I think that there's some, maybe misunderstanding of how those beers are, intended to taste as they're made and served fresh in their own locales. As I was talking to Joe Stang before this, he was mentioning that, comparatively Schönram is a little bit more bitter than maybe some of its compatriots.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
But not that much more bitter. It's not that much further out. How do you all approach this, and how do you think about bitterness in the beer itself?
Well, the southeast Bavarian Helles tend to be higher in bitterness. They also tend to be higher in gravity. Munich Helles is quite a bit lower in gravity, about a half a degree Plato, maybe around 18.3, 18.4. 11.3, 11.4. Plato, bittering units around 14. If you get further east and north, they can go down as low as 12 bittering units. I mean, I would say they just carry the bag of hops through the brew house and
right.
Just show it to the kettle and then keep walking.
Just show it to the kettle. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're at about 19. We always try to hit 19. 20 always seems to be a bit much, and 18 is not enough. So, we're reliably consistent with hitting 19. So it is much more assertively hopped than the Munich style, and we're at 11.9 Plato, so it's higher gravity. And through our high attenuation, it's at 5.3. So that historically has to do with the fact that all the other, so our local competitors, if you will, are, that in breweries within a proximity of 30, 40 kilometers of us, they were all brewing export hay. So they're brewing beers with 12.4 Plato and higher hopping rates. We never did that. We didn't start brewing an export style, and we never called it export. We called it gold until the 1980s. So we were always competing with export style or export hay, but we were making a Helles. So people were always measuring our beer compared to the other local breweries. We never claimed our beer to be export hay, and the others never claimed their beer to be just a Helles. But the consumer always just looks beyond that word export, and they just see hay. And so that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
So we were always being measured against a beer that was about 0.6, 0.7 Plato higher in gravity, and through that already higher in hops. But that's very specific to this region. If you get further southwest, so southwest of Munich, it starts going down in bitterness again. And if you get north of Munich, it goes down first and then it goes back up in Franconia.
Right. Yeah.
But then the Franks start calling their beer, Franconians start calling it a Pils, which is, it's not really, it's kind of like a hoppy Helles. It's always a bit of a different beer wherever you look.
I love the range of possibility within this, that it's maybe a bit wider than the canon as we tend to think about it in the United States might potentially be.
Yeah, there's people who talk about Munich style Helles, and ours definitely is not Munich style.
But there's plenty more to Helles than just Munich style Helles.
That's correct.
There you go. You mentioned Mash Cooker, for a brewery that was founded in 1780 and that is built on this idea of tradition. You're not afraid to try things that might allow you to make beer in better and more effective ways and to achieve that. What's next on, what are the other things that you're looking at, the other kinds of projects that you're working on, and some of the other pieces that you're trying to solve for, or at least understand or learn more about through that process. And, what are the big kind of projects on the horizon for you?
Well, so playing with this mash cooker is gonna be a lot of fun. That is got a lot to do with that, and I'm gonna try.
I'm just setting that up as an excuse to come back and do another episode where we talk about stuff in the future.
Yeah.
I'm just shameless, and all of that. Yeah.
No worries. That's I'm looking forward to that. That's always something that goes. It's a kind of a side gig. Trying something out. I usually do these kind of test brews at night, where there's no phone ringing, there's no email, there's nobody coming in and bothering you. There's just that one shift brewer there in the brew house, and I'll sit there and play with parameters or with process. So I'm going to try that with the wheat beer to try to get more aroma out of it. Just to get more simple sugars in the wheat beer to get even more yeast expression.
Yeah,
but I also want to look at the possibilities of shortening the mash. We have a pretty short mash anyway, of about 2 hours and 10 minutes, but that varies also with the harvest year. But by doing maybe 2 quick decoction steps, if it's not even more efficient, and being able to take that down another 10 minutes, because we're knocking out a beer every 3 hours. We mash in every 3 hours. We start Sunday night, finish Friday afternoon. 36 brews a day. So by adding the mash cooker, we've taken the Saturday away. So the brewers don't have to work on Saturdays anymore. But I'm trying to look at ways of quickening that up even more so we can make more brews in the same time.
Sure.
But not compromise. But actually, the other projects that I have are all very boring.
Yeah.
Well, actually not. I mean, a lot of it's getting some, the handbooks and SOPs and that up to speed. But we have to go. We're going through a process of getting the permission to put up outdoor malt silos. Right now, they're all indoor, but it's all because it's a protected historical monument. We can't compromise the facade or anything like that. So it's a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork and phone calls and emails. One exciting thing that I'm working on is our wastewater treatment plant. We've added an anaerobic digester because we've been treating our wastewater since 1972. But as it's all aerobic, but we're using way too much electricity and producing way too much sludge, which we used to be able to put out on the fields, but we can't do that anymore. So we have to spend a lot of money to get rid of that. And in the end, it gets burned. So it's thermally at least processed. Right. But so by adding an anaerobic digester as a pre-phase to the aerobic, we're going to lower our electricity needs, but also lower our sludge production, and at the same time produce biogas, which we can burn off in our kettle. So right now, the focus for me is going to be benchmarking. I'm working on specific water usage, electricity usage, specific how many kilowatt hours per hectoliter, how many hectoliters of water per hectoliter of beer, and how many hectoliters of wastewater do we produce. And because the Germans, well, we've been ourselves sensitized to that for a long time, but it's now everybody's comparing. It doesn't matter what branch of production you're in, if it's of any industry. Right. People are looking at what is your CO2 footprint. So it's going to be working.
And that becomes all taxable in 2030.
Right. So we've got a lot of solar panels. We're putting up more. We're finally getting in. We've been using oil to produce steam in our steam generator. Finally getting a gas line put in. We've been working on it for 4 years, but until we get the permission to go through 35 properties, not every one of those people drinks our beer. So now we're finally finally getting
right.
getting our gas line. That's not sexy anymore because of some asshole in Russia who decided to invade Ukraine. So now we're trying to get off of gas. Just around the time we're about ready to start using gas, it's also not cool anymore. So
there you go. There you go. Well, Eric, I think that's a great place to wrap this up. I could talk for another couple hours, but I imagine your dad would like to do something else later on today and not just sit here and listen to us podcasting here. G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. The Malt House is your online source for cool and exclusive raw malting company gear. Think outside the puree box with craft concentrates from Old Orchard. Arrived is the mobile all-in-one solution you need to decrease service friction and increase guest satisfaction, and put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house. As always, your magazine subscription directly supports our ability to bring you this podcast each week. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and let us know that this content matters to you. Thanks again to the team at Blacktooth here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, for letting us take over their office to record this podcast.
Thank you.
Appreciate them. Thank you. Thank you. And Eric, if people want to learn more about Private Landbrauerei Schönram, where do they find more about you?
So www.schönramer.de. So that's SCHO with 2 dots over it. I mean, I think you can do that now on every keyboard. NRAMER.de. So, or Schönramer, so OE instead of the O with the umlaut. Or www.brauerei, so BRAUEREI -Schönram.de.
Beers available in America. There's an importer out of California that brings you in here, and you're available in a few states. And so if you'd like to have that beer yourself, you can get it here in the United States of America.
You can. There's a gentleman out in Santa Monica, Mark Gerlach. Sounds very German, but he's an American guy, former pro tennis player, and he's a big fan of our beers, and he brings some beers from our area.
And you can find it in better beer bars around the country, including places like Greg Engert's bars in Washington, D.C., because, of course, he's a big fan of yours, too. Anyway, thanks for joining me on the podcast, Eric. It's been phenomenal to talk to you. I'm glad we finally got this in this year. We couldn't do it in Brussels at Cantillon, but here we are at your hometown of Cheyenne, and it's been fantastic talking about lager brewing with you. Cheers.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thanks for the invitation.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.